All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the Shurim and Drashos this month as a schus for Refuah Shalem of Kathy's sister, Dana Baker Matson. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she will enjoy a complete and enduring refuah. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Brian and Melanie Levine, in honor of the entire Shir, and with Hakara Satov, and with the hope and the Meretz Hashem aspiration that we are zocheh to learn together for many, many years to come. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Yud Zayin 17. We are picking up on Tes Zayin Amud Beis 16b. I think we left off about 17 lines up from the bottom. Massive Ravoshia, last two words on the line. So if you remember again, in yesterday's daf, towards the end of the daf, we kind of shifted focus a little bit. Well, we continued on the same theme, but I wanted to suggest that maybe the original machlokes of the Masechta, the machlokes Rabbah and Rava, about the need for about the need for b'fanei nechtam, thank you. About the need for b'fanei nechtam maybe is a machlokes tanoim. So the Gemara is working through that a little bit. So the Gemara says, Maser Ravoshia le'ula. So Ravoshia asked the following shaila to Ula. Rabbi Yehuda machshe bezu. Rabbi Yehuda ultimately said that in the case of Shnayim Omrim B'fanei Nechtav, Ve'echad Omer B'fanei Nechtam, Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah that halacha l'maaseh that case works. V'lo b'acharas. But ultimately, again, he did not go ahead and say that other variations of the Mishnah's case would be kosher. My love, l'mi'ute achad Omer B'fanei Nechtav, Ve'echad Omer B'fanei Nechtam, isn't that coming to exclude the case of where one guy says b'fanei nechtav and one guy says b'fanei nechtam? Lo, l'mi'ute b'fanei nechtam, aval lo b'fanei nechtav. No, it's coming to exclude the case of the guy where you have one witness who says b'fanei nechtam, ultimately again but not b'fanei nechtav. I'm sorry, just the opposite. Lo l'mi'ute b'fanei nechtam, aval lo b'fanei nechtav. It comes to exclude the case of the guy who says b'fanei nechtam, it was signed in front of me, but it was not written in front of me. Why? I would have thought, since Rabbi Yehuda, again, as we saw in yesterday's daf, since Rabbi Yehuda felt, remember again, even according to Rabbah, who originally held that halacha l'maisa, so the entire enactment of b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam is because of lishma, right? Remember again, he also acknowledged that halacha l'maisa achar shalamdu. Ultimately, again, there was a point in time where Medinas Hayam, they in fact did understand that you had to write Lishma, and they understood how to do it. And then there was a concern of Shemiyach Shadavar L'Kulkulo. Is there a concern that maybe things will revert back to what they once were? So the Gemara says as follows. I would have thought, since Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned that things will revert back to what they once were before, then what? Maybe at the end of the day, you should be worried that you'll come to go ahead and, all right, you made the point. So maybe now you should be concerned that things ultimately will go ahead and be confused with other cases of kiyum shtaros. So the Gemara says, nami lo gazar, kamash malon not. Fine. Itmar nami Rabbi Yehuda, shnaim sheviu get Medinas Hayam, banu lemachlokes Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. Furthermore, again, Rabbi say it was said, according to Rabbi Yehuda says, two people who brought a get from Medinas Hayam, so two people who brought the get from overseas, we have here effectively come to the machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. So good. So we'll say that's the statement. So you see over here that this ultimately again is the machlokes case in Shnaim Sheviuge. So remember again, I will say this. The Gemara mentioned also in yesterday's daf about this concept of whether or not when you have two witnesses bringing the get from Medinas Hayam, is b'fanei nechtav and b'fanei nechtam necessary at all? So that remains an outstanding matter. That remains a machlokes. We're going to see the Rambam in that in just a little bit. Meanwhile, I will say an interesting Maisa. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Rabba bar bar Chana chalash. Rabba bar bar Chana became ill. The Gemara says, all ligabe, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabba, lishaluyebe. So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabba came to visit him. They came to visit. So Rabba is sick. Rabbi Chana is sick. Rabbi Yehuda and actually changes it to Rava. Yeah, it changes it, or the Rabbanon. Hagosim changes it to the Rabbanon. Okay, so we'll call it Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon came to visit him. Bo'omine. So they asked of Rabbah, who was in bed. Bo'omine. Shnaim sheviu get Medina sayam tzrichen shemur feinechtam or ain't tzrichen. So we'll say. So they inquired of him, when two people bring the get from overseas, do they have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam or not? I would say, by the way, what a profound Musar Haskell, right? They're coming to do Bikur Cholim, right? And ultimately, again, so there's so many lessons to be gleaned just from this one little episode. First, again, I will say the greatness of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, that even when he's sick, ultimately, again, what is he occupied with? He's occupied with Torah. He's occupied with right. They're coming to do Bikur Cholim. So ultimately, again, what's happening? They ask him a shayla. You would think again, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana is ill. These guys are coming to these Rabbanim are coming to be Mevakir Chola. They're coming to visit the sick. So you would think, I don't know, make some small talk, make this for Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. Ultimately, again, Kula Torah. Kula Torah will say, what a musa for us. You know, sometimes what happens, you know, we get a sniffle, we get a headache. I can't come to shir today. You know, it's a little too much. Or you know what? Or I can't sit there, I can't concentrate. I would say, what it means to be Amel B'Torah is to power through, even sometimes when you're not quite feeling up to it. Right? Sometimes I'm just not feeling 100%, or many times I'm not feeling 100%. So what's my job? What do I have to do? Power through it. Power through it. Rabbi Bar Chana is sick. If he's sick enough that people come to Mevakir Chola, that means, by the way, he's pretty sick. Yet, again, even from the sick bed, ultimately, again, let's learn. But say you also see something beautiful about the person of Rabbi Bar Chana. The mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, Rabbi say, is ultimately, again, to attend to the needs of the other. That's the mitzvah, to attend to the needs of the other. It could also very well be that when Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon come to be Mevakir Chola by Rabbi Bar Chana, they understood that what did he need? He needed a conversation in Torah. Like that's the din of Bikur Cholim. Not just to go out and show up and make small talk. That's part of it. Showing up is definitely part of it. But once you're there to see, what does the Cholim need? So again, I will say, could very well be, they saw what did Rabbi Bar Chana need? So beautiful. What did he need? He needed to talk in Torah. In any event, so they ask him, what is the halacha with two people who bring a get from Medina Sayam? Do they have to say b'fanei nechtam or not? Or in tzrichen, Amr lahem, he said to them, in tzrichen, you don't have to. If two people bring a get, you do not have to say b'fanei nechtam or b'fanei nechtam. After all, ma ilu yomru b'fanenu girsha mi lo mehemni. After all, again, if let's say we'll say two witnesses would show up, and they would just say, right, Rachel was divorced in our presence. Would they not be believed? Or others will say, two witnesses are a bona fide testimonial unit. Once you have a testimonial unit saying that Rachel is divorced from Ruvain, then what? That's it. We don't need anything else. So because just their mere existence as a testimonial unit certifies the process, therefore, halacha l'maisa, there is no need for them to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. Okay, so we'll say, so that's how Rabbi Bar Chana paskin, two witnesses who bring the get from Medina Sayam do not have to say b'fanei nechtam. We'll say, now here's the interesting part. So now, just imagine the scene. So Rabbi Bar Chana is sick in bed, and Rabbi Yehuda, and we'll call it different gersals, but Rabbi ultimately come to visit him. So I'll say, so as they're sitting there, Adahachi asa hahu chavra, top of Yud Zayin, as they're sitting there, a chavra. Now we'll say, or a chabra. Rashi says, parsoi. This Persian guy comes in, shakla l'shraga mikamayu, and he took out the candle, the lantern, from in front of them. Now, what's going on over here? Take a look at the top Rashi on Yuzayin of 17a, top Rashi. Shakla shrag l'shraga, sheyesh leparsim yom iyad shehem madlikin arba osa yom ela beis avodah zara shalahen. So I'll say the Persians had some type of holiday for their avodah zara. That's what? That the rule was you are not allowed to kindle lamps anywhere but the house of avodah zara. That was the rule, right? So on their holiday, the only place we're allowed to go ahead and kindle candles, ultimately, again, was in Barsa. By the way, the Gemara Maseches Avodah Zarah makes reference to this practice as well. It must have been some type of known practice that you could only light candles in the base of Avodah Zarah, in the house of idolatry that day. So if you can imagine the scene, these three rabbanim, right? Rabbi Chana is sick. Rav Yehuda and Rabbah come to visit him. They're sitting there. There's a candle lit in the home. They're in the middle of talking. Right in the middle of talking, what happens? Some Persian guy, right, bursts in, goes ahead and takes the candle, or extinguishes the candle, takes it with him. So what they said, Amar. So they said, Amar Rachmana. They said, Ribono Shalom. So they were so, I will say, what a moment. Here they are sitting and learning together, right? And again, Rabbi Bar Chana himself is ill. So they say, like in a moment of desperation, Amar Rachmana, Obetulach, O Betula Debar Esav. Let us either dwell in your shadow or in the shadow of the children of Esav. Now, I will say this is a very dramatic statement. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Amar Rabbi Bar Chana. So the Gemara understands that it was Rabbi Bar Chana who was the sick person. He said, Rachmana, O Betulach, O Hechbi'anu B'tzilach, either hide us, right? Either hide us, or in your shadow, O Heglinu B'tzel B'nei Esav, we'll say this is incredible. Either HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the ideal would be, let us exist solely in your presence, in your shadow. But if we have to be in Galus, please let us be under the rulership, ultimately, of Bnei Esav, of the children of Esav, rather than ultimately, again, under the rulership of the Persians. So I'll say, so this is actually a pretty dramatic statement. So Rabbi Chia said, so the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Lememra, Diramai Ma'alimin Parsoi. They both say, is that to say that it's better for the Jews to be under the rulership of the Romans than it is the Persians? As I will say, it's just such a tremendous Gemara, right? Rabbi Rachana ultimately saying, Ribon Shalom, we don't want to be under any foreign dominion. We don't want to be under any foreign, but if we have to be under a foreign dominion, please give us over to the children of Esav and do not give us over effectively to the children of Ishmael, right? Do not give us over to the Persians. So the Gemara says, is that to say that it's better to be under the rulership of Esav, the Romans, than it is the Persians? Vatani Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia taught, Mai dichsiv, what's the meaning of the pasuk? Elokim hevin darka, so we'll say, what's the meaning of the pasuk in Eov? HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands the way, and he knows its place. Yodea HaKadosh Baruch Hu be Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows about Klal Yisrael. She'ein yicholin lekabel gzeras romim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that we cannot go ahead and withstand the persecutorial edicts of the Romans. We cannot go ahead and withstand Roman persecution. Amad v'higla osam labavel. Therefore, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do for us? Ultimately, again, he exiles us to Bavel. So we'll say, what do you see from this? What do you see from this? Much better to be in Bavel, ultimately, again, than it is to go ahead and be under the rulership of Bnei Esav. I will say, by the way, it's incredible. And sometimes we have to take a step back and be so incredibly appreciative. The plight of the Jew for so many generations was essentially, who would you rather be persecuted by? Right? That was like the national question, right? Whose hands do we want to be delivered into, right? Would we rather be delivered into the hands of the Persians or into the hands of the Romans, right? This was like the question. Who's going to hate us less, right? Who's going to kill us less? Who's going to persecute us less? Let's say sometimes it is so important, sometimes all the time, it is so important to go ahead and take a step back and to have such gratitude towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the times in which we live. Less than a century, after 6 million of our precious brothers and sisters were systematically murdered, we are experiencing an incredible golden age in Jewry. Is there anti-Semitism? Sure. Again, everybody follows the news. You heard about that speech that was made at the CUNY Law School graduation. Overwhelming. absolutely over blatant anti-Semitism happening in New York City, in New York institutions. It is beyond comprehension what is happening. Don't Google it now. I'll say, but is there anti-Semitism? Of course there's anti-Semitism. Is there us? But I will say, but to understand, there's always going to be anti-Semitism. I will say, but to understand, like, we don't live in that time. Right? We don't live in that time where we have to decide, do you want to be handed over into the hands of the Persians or into the hands of the Romans? We live in a different time. We also live in a time, Baruch Hashem, of Eretz Yisrael, where if a Jew wants to go home, a Jew absolutely has that opportunity to do so. It's just important. We're living in incredible times. But for generations, this was the shaila of the Jew. The Romans or the Persians, right? Who's going to hate us less? Incredible akar, so we have to have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Point over here is that Rabbi Rachan is davening HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Don't deliver us into the hands of the Persians, but rather again put us into the hands of the Romans. But yet you see over here that it's better to be in Bavel than it is to be under the Romans. To which the Gemara says, Lo kasha hamikamei dinaisi chabri lebavel halabasar daasi chabri lebavel. So we'll say Bavel used to be a good place until the Persians moved in. You know those Persians, right? So until the Persians moved in, then everything went bad. So apparently, we'll say, we know again, by the way, just the way it worked, right, is that there was Bavel, then ultimately again, Bavel morphs into the Persian Median Empire afterwards. So apparently, Bavel, before Persia took over, ultimately, again, was a good existence for the Jews. Once the Persians came in, then ultimately, again, everything went south. So the point that Rabbi, so again, Bavel, when there was a choice between Bavel and ultimately Bnei Esav, it would have been Bavel. But ultimately, again, once the Persians came to Bavel, and ultimately, again, would have preferred Bnei Esav. I will say, by the way, you have to understand how bad life must have been under the Persians, that means, which is pretty amazing, because some of the worst atrocities ever to occur to Klal Yisrael happened through Bnei Esav, right? Not through the Persians, right? Not through. So it's just interesting. Again, obviously, this is before many of those atrocities occurred, but it's just interesting. Anyway, I will say, so good. So I will say, so I just want to point out, so we're still left with this question. Ultimately, again, about Shnaim Sheviu get Medina Sayam. If two people bring the get from Medina Sayam, do they have to say Farnechtam and Farnechtam? Right? Do you have to, so that's still an open-ended question, which we'll see in the Rambam in just a little bit. Weiter. Says the Gemara. So Tana. So Echad Omer B'fanei Nechtav, Ushnaim Omer B'fanenu Nechtam Kasher. If one witness says B'fanei Nechtav, and two witnesses say B'fanenu Nechtam, the get is kasher. Am Rabbi Ami, Am Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Shanu Ela, Shaget Yotzi Mitachas Yad Eid Ksiva. This is only true if the shaliach who's bringing the get is the one who witnessed the writing. Why? Because if that's the case, dinasu kishnayim alzeh ukishnayim alzeh. Because then I will say, watch this. If you have one witness say b'fanei nechtav and two witnesses say b'fanei nechtam, and the witness who saw the ksiva, the writing, is the one who brings the get. So effectively, what you have is two witnesses on the ksiva and two witnesses on the chasima. Because remember again, the aide who brings the get ultimately again has the power of two witnesses. So therefore you have 2 and 2, and therefore the get is going to be kasher. Aval mitachas yedei eidei chasima, but ultimately again if the get is brought by the eidei chasima, pasul, then ultimately again the get will be pasul. Why? Alma kasavar shnaim sheviu get medina sayam, because we see from here that when two people bring the get from Medina Sayam, tzrichen sheyomru b'fanenu nechtav or b'fanenu nechtam. So I'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here because halacha l'maisa, when two people bring the get, they do have to say b'fanenu nechtav or b'fanenu nechtam. These two guys could only say what? B'fanenu nechtam and not b'fanenu nechtav. Therefore, it's not going to be good. Amrli Rabbi Yasi Elamiata. If that's true, but look at the Reisha. Reisha diktani shnaim omrim b'fanenu nechtav ve'echad omer b'fanei nechtam. Right. Ultimately, again, if two people say b'fanenu nechtav and one says b'fanei nechtam, pasul. Such a get is pasul. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says ultimately again the get is kosher. Va'afilu get yotzei mitachas yidei shnehem pasli rabbanon. Now, would it be true that even if you have two people bringing the get, that the rabbanon would say that it's pasul? Amar le'in. He said yes. Zimnin ashkechei diyasa v'kamar. So we'll say later on, ultimately again, he found him, right? He found him sitting and saying as follows: "K'kamar, tafilu get yotzi mitachas de ede chasima kasher." Ultimately, seems to be a reverse. That even if the get is ultimately delivered by the ede chasima, it'll still be kasher. Alma kasavar. Therefore, he holds shneim shev you get medinas hayam, that when two people go ahead and bring a get from medinas hayam, ein tzrichin shiyomru b'fanenu nechtav u'b'fanenu nechtam. They don't have to say b'fanenu nechtav b'fanenu nechtam. Amar Rabbi Yassi said, "Elamiata reisha diktani shnayim omrim b'fanenu nechtav ve'echad omer b'fanenu nechtam pasol." But 1 second, what about the reisha that says two people say b'fanenu nechtav, one person says b'fanenu nechtam, that the get is pasol? Rabbi Huda says ultimately is kasher. Taima, the reason is the ein haget yotzi mitachas de shneim. The reason ultimately is because two people are not delivering the get. Ha get yotzi mitachas de shneim machshir rabbanon. But it sounds like I will say that's what? That if the get ultimately again would be coming through both of them, or be right with both of them, that ultimately again the rabbanon would hold that is kasher. Amrlein say yes, that is true. 1 second. V'hazimnin lo amrat lan hachi. But beforehand you didn't say this to us. Amrlein, so Rabasi said, yes, said he, shelo tamut. The truth is, I retracted my position, but ultimately, again, this position is like an embedded peg that will not be moved. This is my new position, and this is the immutable position. I will say, by the way, it's actually just, first let's just see the halal. So I will say, so bottom line, there's a lot of things kind of flying around out here, but really the core issue for us is shnayim sheviu get mechutz laaretz. I will say, so remember again, so two takeaways from this sugi so far. I will say number one takeaway is, because we're going to move on to a new sugi right now, the new Mishnah. Number one takeaway is you can't mix and match processes, right? Halacha l'maisa again, either okula b'kiyum shtaros, okula b'kiyu b'fanechtam fanechtam, right? When certifying a get, certification has to go ahead and decide on has to be one cohesive process. See, either kiyum shtaros, which is just two witnesses certifying that the signatures on the document are legitimate, and therefore again the get is upheld, or b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam. But you can't go ahead and do half of it from b'fanei nechtav and half of it from b'fanei nechtam. Rabbi say, ultimately again the Musar Haskell of that, choose a lane. Choose a lane in life. So many times in life, we're dabbling a little bit in this, we're dabbling a little bit in that, right? I learned some of this, I learned some of that. One day I'm doing this, one day I'm doing that. I'm consistent here, I'm not consistent here. I'm consistent today, not consistent tomorrow. Choose a lane. Choose a lane. Now, it doesn't mean that over time you can't switch lanes, but choose a lane in life and ultimately stick with it. Because the only way we truly grow in life is when we stick with something. If we're always veering all over the place, so you might feel, sometimes people like going all over because you feel like you're accomplishing a lot, but you're not. You're not. Like anything in life, if you want to accomplish, stay the course, stay in the lane, do what you have to do. When you finish what you have to do, then Amir Hashem, move on to something else. That's Aleph. So we'll say next, what about the Shnayim Sheviu? So listen to this. So the Rambam Hilchos Gerushin, Perek Zayin, Halacha Yudalet. Here it is. Get ready for it. Shnayim Sheviu get b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say ultimately again, two people bring a get from overseas. Afapi shelo nechtav v'nechtam ifneihem hoyo unasano lahamabal litno leishto hare elu nosnin la v'tiyem migureshes. So we'll say. So first of all, ultimately again, the Rambam paskins that halacha l'maisa, two people who bring a get from overseas do not have to say b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtam, right? And I will say it's a very simple reason, because remember, this is assuming that both of these individuals were vested with the responsibility of delivering the get. So I will say it's very simple. Reuven is divorcing Rachel. He gives the get to aid 1 and aid 2. I will say the mere fact that Reuven is giving a get to be delivered to his wife Rachel to two witnesses, that's it. That's it. In other words, they saw the get written, they didn't see the get written. It makes absolutely no difference. Right? Halacha l'maisa, the fact that he is giving it over to two witnesses, so they can now act as eidos once the get is delivered, and therefore logically, b'fanei nechtav and b'fanei nechtam is no longer needed. Now, I will say the Rambam does qualify this, and he said, as I just mentioned before, Bizman shayet yotzi mitachas yidei shnehem. Obviously, we'll say that only works in a case where both of those witnesses are vested with the responsibility of get delivery as well. So they are the delivery mechanism. So the husband is giving it over to them, and ultimately, again, they are delivering. So the get literally comes from both of them, so to speak. If that's the case, then ultimately, again, b'fanei nechtav and b'fanei nechtam, ultimately, again, is not required. Obviously, we'll say if one of them is one of them is the shliach, one of them is not. Anytime you don't have two, you're going to require b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. But halacha l'maisa, for our purposes, ultimately two people delivering the get on behalf of the wife from Medina Sayam, b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam is not needed. Incredible. But I just draw your attention also before I move on to the Mishnah, that last statement of Rabbi Asi, which was really from Rabbi Asi, is I've changed my mind. Yased hi shelo tavot, and it's a peg that will not be moved. It will say one of the hardest things in life is to try to figure out what are the things for which you should stand your ground and never compromise. And what are the things, ultimately, again, where it is good to go ahead and be mevater? Rabbi Nachman has an essay, and the essay is titled Tov Lihios Vatron. That's the title of the essay. It's good to be mevater. Mevater means to yield. It's good to be a yielding person, right? It's good not to be the kind of person, we've quoted many, many times, right, that the beautiful Katzker brings down in the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos, that says that one of the miracles in the Mishkan, in the Beis Hamikdash, was Omdim Tzufufim Mishtachavim Revachim. Right? When they would stand up in the Mishkan, everybody would be packed like sardines, but when they would bow down, ultimately there was room for everyone. The Rabbeinu Yonah understands on that Mishnah that it's actually talking about Yom Kippur. That on Yom Kippur, when everybody was packed, because everybody wanted to see the Kohen Gadol. But here's the problem: when they bowed down, we bowed down for vidui. When you recite vidui, you want privacy. I don't want someone else hearing my averus. In fact, the Rambam says that you're not supposed to publicize your averus. It's because it says it's a sense of gaiva. So what would happen? When they would bow down and say vidui, a miracle would happen. So everyone was able to say vidui in privacy. The Katzker says something so beautiful. The Katzker says it's also a metaphor for life. Omdim. There are some people who always stand their ground. Some people who always have to be right, my way or the highway. They're an omei. They're always standing. If you always stand your ground, sefufim, there's no room for anyone else. Everyone feels stifled in your presence, and you're going to have difficulty establishing relationships. No room for anyone else. Conversely, mishtachavim. What does it mean, mishtachavim? If you bow, if you're mevater, if you don't always have to be right, if you could yield, revachim, there's enough room for everyone. But I will say, that being said, there are certain things in life that you can't yield on, right? There are certain things in life I can't cross this line. I can't be mevater. I can't yield. Identify. I will say, those are the things in life of yased hi shelo tamut. This is a peg. This is a peg that's firmly embedded, and it will not move. Trying to figure out in life, what are the things in which I can bow on? What are the things in which I can be mevater? And what are the very few things, ultimately, again, that are the embedded pegs that cannot be moved? Probably one of the hardest things in life, right? Knowing when to stand your ground and knowing when to yield and finding that correct balance ultimately is part of the secret of successful living. We'll say Mishnah, great new sugya. So we'll say this effectively closes out the b'fanei nechtav and b'fanei nechtam sugya. So we'll say what we emerge with, by the way, is a really fascinating idea. That halacha l'maisa, right, if we kind of pull it all together, halacha l'maisa, you have to say b'fanei nechtav, right, if you're delivering a get from Medina Sayam, you have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam. But I will say, when you kind of pull it all together, so originally it was a machlokis, but really like contemporarily, why do you have to say b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam? Why? Everyone kind of comes to the same place. Because even Rabbah, who originally said you have to say it, why? Because lefi she'ein bikiyin l'shma, they don't know the shma, also acknowledge that what? Acha shalamdu. They learned l'shma, right? But even so, there's still a reason ultimately to still continue to say b'fanei nechtam. Why? Either maybe things will revert back to what they once were, or because we saw, because you need kiyum stars, because we saw that Rabbah still agreed with Rava. So interestingly enough, kind of when it kind of all comes together, we're still going to say if I nechtam now, right? But when I say now, no, I say what I mean now, like Gimel, right? Now, but halacha l'maisa really because of kiyum shtaros, or out of a concern that things may return to a previous state of disrepair. Good. Well, I mean, we're not fully finished. It's still going to come up again, but new sugya. Mishnah. Nechtav bayom v'nechtam balayla. So we'll say this is very exciting, very, very exciting. Although it's not the primary sugya, we're going to touch on now the concept of zman begin. The idea that a get has to be dated, has to have a date. So also therefore the Gemara says, Nechtav bayom v'nechtam balayla. Ultimately, again, if the get is written by day and ultimately signed at night, written by day and signed by day. Balayla v'nechtam balayla, written by day and signed by Nechtav balayla v'nechtam balayla, written by night and signed by night. Balayla v'nechtam bayom, or written at night and signed by day, kosher. Now we'll say, what's come down there amongst all these three cases? Same calendar day. Right? The writing and the signing has all happened on the same calendar day. As long as that occurs, ultimately, again, it is fine. I will say Rashi points out over here, Hainu chad yoma ve'ein kan get muktam. So let's talk about this just for a second. There's a concept called a shtar muktam. A shtar muktam calls means a pre-dated document. A document that has a date which is earlier than the actual chalos. Than the actual, we'll call it chalos, activation or execution of the document. And I will say, sometimes this doesn't matter, sometimes it does matter. Whenever a document produces either a lien on property or an ability to collect property, you can't have a date that is earlier than the actual execution. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, then you've created a lien before the transaction actually occurred. And that'll put potential buyers, potential purchasers at a disadvantage. We'll come back to it in just a moment. So let's go. Back to the Mishnah. Very exciting. We'll say second of the wide lines. Bayom v'nechtam balayla. What happens if you wrote the get by day and signed it at night? So we'll say in that case, right, puzzle. Ultimately, again, it's going to be puzzle. What I will say, that is called the shtar muktam. Literally translated, an early shtar. So let's say the get, right? Today is Yud Gimel Sivan. So therefore, again, if I were to go ahead and date the get on today, Yud Gimel Sivan, but not actually, again, write it or execute it or sign it until tonight, ultimately, again, I've created an artificial early lien. Right? All right, good. Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol Gittin shekasvu bayom v'nechtemu balayla psulin chutz mi Gittin Hashem. So we'll say, then we have this position of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, all documents, we'll say Gittin in this context means documents, any documents written, and Rashi says, what kind of documents? Sale documents, right? Mecher, matana, halva. So sale documents, gift documents, loan documents, ultimately, again, that are written by day and signed at night are possible, except for Gittin, except for divorce documents. Again, we'll explain Rabbi Shimon in just a moment. I'll just point out, by the way, just so you should know, we encounter this all the time, and sometimes you might even not even know that it's been encountered. How so? You know this often comes up? This comes up at chasanos, right? At a wedding. You have to have a ksuva. You have to have a ksuva, right? A ksuva, say, what is a ksuva? A ksuva ultimately, again, is a document of debt, right? It essentially says, right, you can put as much artwork on that as you want, right? But at the end of the day, what that says is, husband, you are encumbered. You are encumbered, right? That lamais, again, anything and everything you own and will ever own is encumbered ultimately, again, to the ksuva. Now listen to this. So this is why, if you notice, sometimes, depending on the time of year, right, when you write that ksuva, the chuppah has to occur on the same date of that ksuva. Has to occur on the same date. Because if the ksuva says one date, let's say the ksuva says Yud Gimel, right, and the chuppah takes place technically, calendrically, on your Dalid, then what you've done is you've created an encumbrance upon all of the husband's property earlier than the actual marriage took place. So that is an artificially early encumbrance, which I will say, let's say again at the chassan's tish, the husband did some business, right? Did some business, right? He transacted there are some people who are always doing deals, right? So he did a deal. So I say, now what happens? He did a deal before he was married. So Lamais, again, that deal should really be unencumbered. But now, again, based on the date on the ksuva, it's encumbered. So that's why you have to be very careful. That's interesting enough. Minhag Yerushalayim, they have a very interesting minhag, which is they do the ksuva under the chuppah. Under the chuppah. In other words, the ksuva itself is dated and signed under the chuppah itself, so as to avoid any kind of confusion. But again, depending on the time of year, you could definitely run into these type of issues. In any event, I will say, very exciting sugya. Itmar, mipnei ma tiknu zman begin. I will say, ultimately, again, why did Chazal institute a date and a get? In other words, why does a get need a date? So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yochanan says, Mishum basachoso. I will say, this is fascinating. Rabbi Yochanan said, because of a concern that a person may protect his niece. Right? Basachoso, the daughter of his sister. What does this mean? I will say, take a look at Rashi. Mishum basachoso. Rashi says, the Ishtar. And I will say, by the way, what I want to point out, what's driving the Gemara's question is, you're asking yourself, well, of course you could have put a date in the get. The Gemara will say, here's what the Gemara's question is based on. A get in its essence is not a document of collection, right? It's not a document of collection, right? I will say, what's the, right, after a woman is divorced, what's her document of collection? Her ksuva, right? Ksuva is that, so a get is not a document of collection. A get is just a document that says she's divorced. So if it's not a document of collection, then why does it need a date? Right? You want to say it's an interesting point. In other words, all she really needs to show is, okay, I'm divorced. I have my get. Right? She's not collecting anything with it, why does it need a date? So we'll say this is incredible. Rabbi Yochanan says, you're right. Mishum basachoso. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. We're concerned about the following case. A man who's married to his niece. Technically speaking, a person is allowed to marry his niece. So we'll say, what's the issue? V'hu ishtar, she says, v'shema tizna tachtov, maybe she's going to commit adultery. V'chas ala shelo techanek, v'kosev laget below zman, v'nosin la, u'kishemi'idin ala bebeizin motzia gita v'omeres, krusha yisi u'pnui ba'osasha. We'll say this is fascinating. What are we concerned about? Let's say a man is married to his niece, and let's say again, Reuven's married to Rachel, and Rachel is Reuven's niece. Rachel commits adultery. I will say, normally, if the wife commits adultery, the husband may not care about what does or doesn't happen, right? But Lamais, in the case of his niece, he doesn't want her to be executed, right? Because after all, again, he has Rachmanas on his sister, even if he doesn't have Rachmanas on his wife. So we'll say, so what could he do? If there's no Zman Gittin, he could quickly write her a divorce document and give it to her. And then what happens? When she's summoned to Beis Din and witnesses come along and testify that she committed adultery, what could she do? Produce the document that was divorced. And I will say, because there's no date in it, no one, there's no way of knowing, was she divorced at the time of the supposed adultery or not? So I will say, so essentially Rabbi Yochanan says, in order that one does not go ahead and exploit the use of a get to circumvent the halachos of adultery, we have a date put in there. Rish Lakish says, no, mishum peiros. And we'll say, no, it's about peiros. We'll say, remember again, when a woman brings in property into a marriage, halacha l'maisa, she retains title, but husband gets usage over that property. And we'll say, what are we concerned about? That ultimately, again, a husband is going to go ahead and continue to sell his wife's property even after they're divorced, right? It's going to have no recourse. If the get has no date in it, so Lamaisa, again, he could claim that what? We were still married. That's why I was able to sell the property. Therefore, if you put a date in the get, ultimately, again, as of that date, husband no longer has the ability to utilize the peiros on the property. Look at Rashi, Mishum Peiros, Shemizmana gets the ilach from the date written in the get and on, Imyim Kara Bal Peiros, Nichsim Elok Shala, Tigveim. If he tries to sell any of the Peiros from her property, ultimately she has the ability to collect it from the purchasers. Vimlo Hayabosman, and if there was no date in a get, Yemocher Vaholech, he could just continue to sell. Ukishetitava Ladin, have you Yoda al Tachton Shimola Kodim Gerish and Macharti. So both say, so therefore again, two different approaches. Rabbi Yochanan says, the date is in the get to prevent the husband from protecting an adulterous wife. Reish Lakish says the date is in the get to protect the wife, ultimately again from the husband continuously selling the peiros even when he's no longer entitled to it. Incredible. Reish Gemara says, Reish Lakish, my time like Rabbi Yochanan. Why doesn't Reish Lakish hold like Rabbi Yochanan? So let's listen to this. Amar, he says, Znus lo shchicha. Zus no shchicha. Shabbos, you're like, What? Right? Znus lo shchicha. Znus is pretty shchicha. Right? I'll say znus is pretty shchicha. So what does that mean? So we'll say Tosfos comes along and says, no. When Rish Lakish says znus lo shchicha, immorality is not common, he means perish. Tosfos is Tosfos. Znus be'edim uba'asra lo shchiach. So we'll say, so the type of znus, we'll say again, what is Rish Lakish saying? Rish Lakish is saying, put a date in the get, because this way again, if Rachel goes ahead and commits adultery with witnesses and with hasra, and now she's brought to Beis Din, ultimately again to be executed, she can go ahead and produce the get without a date and claim that she was divorced, and no one could really contest that. Rish Lakish says ultimately again, Rish Lakish says that type of znus is very uncommon. Right, a situation like that, that someone's going to actually have committed adultery with Eidim and Hasra, which is what you need in order to be executed, would be a very uncommon occurrence. Fine. But Rabbi Yochanan, my time with Lomar Kish Lakish. Shabbos say, why does Rabbi Yochanan hold the Kish Lakish? Remember again, Rabbi Yochanan holds that Allah Chalamais again, he holds that Zman Beget was Mishum Basachoso. Why doesn't he hold like Kish Lakish in terms of Peros? To which the Gemara says, Kasavar, this is incredible. Kasavar, Yesh Labal Peros at Shas Nesina. We'll say this is fascinating. We're going to talk a lot about this. We'll say, when does a husband lose his rights in his wife's property? When does he? Shabbos say, so we've been assuming up until now that the moment the get is written, he loses his rights. Shabbos say, Rabbi Yochanan holds, no. He actually holds on to his rights until when? Until the get is delivered. In other words, we'll say the writing of a get is fine. It's part of the process. But I will say, just because you write a get, they're a bona fide married couple, right? The only time that they are divorced is after the nesina. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says that lamaisa, the property is not his, but the usage rights, the peros are his until the time that the get is delivered. Therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yochanan will say the date in the get is meaningless vis-a-vis his usage rights. Right? What's meaningful is when witnesses see that the get was given over. Ultimately, again, that's when he loses his usage rights. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Bishlam Reish Lakish, Bishum Hachi Kamach Shir Rabbi Shimon. So let's go back for just a second. So remember again, we had Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. What did Rabbi Shimon say? That was Rabbi Shimon was of the opinion that bayom v'nechtam ba'layla, if you have a get written by day and signed that night, Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher. So says the Gemara, so according to Reish Lakish, remember again, Reish Lakish says it's about Peros. So according to Reish Lakish, mishum hachi kamach Rabbi Shimon. Ultimately, again, I understand why Rabbi Shimon says that such a get is kosher. Now, I will say, take a look at Rashi. Mishum hachi, it's Rashi on the top, third line down from the top in the wide lines. Mishum hachi mach Rabbi Shimon, beget mukdam, kedam l'kaman Rabbi Shimon, because kasar Rabbi Shimon, kevan shenasan einav lagarsha, shuv ein lo peros. So I will say, listen to this. We're going to see something absolutely amazing. Rabbi Shimon is actually of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, as soon as a husband decides to divorce his wife, he's lost peros. So I just want to point out what's very exciting about the sugyas, even before we go on, just so you should already see what's brewing over here, coming attractions. I will say it looks like we have three different opinions as to when a husband loses usage rights of his wife's nichsei malug. Either when, at the time of the writing of the get, right? B, the time of the delivery of the get, or now C, Rabbi Shimon, at the moment he decides to divorce his wife. Fascinating. Again, we'll get more into it, but the Gemara says like this. So now I understand. So Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah said that if you date a get by day, but ultimately, again, don't sign it, execute until night, ultimately, again, the get is kosher. So that makes sense. According to Reish Lakish, remember again, Reish Lakish's whole concern is what? Peros. We need a date in the get because we don't want the husband selling rights that are not his, or selling peros that are not his. So what the date does is the date firmly establishes the end of the rights of the husband in his wife's peros. So Bishlam Reish Lakish, Mishum Hachi Kamach Rabbi Shimon. I understand ultimately again why Rabbi Shimon says that a get written by day, dated by day, but not actually executed by night is going to be kosher, because according to Rabbi Shimon anyway, right, the husband is losing rights in peros at the time he decides to divorce his wife. Al Rabbi Yochanan, my time with Rabbi Shimon the Machshir. Rabbi Yochanan who holds that the reason you put the date in the get is Shemi Chapa Basachoso, to protect an adulterous wife. Why does Rabbi Shimon say that a get written by day, signed at night, or dated by day, signed at night is going to be kosher? Rabbi Yochanan would say, you're right. Rabbi Shimon lo kamina. The truth is, I'm not really talking in the position of Rabbi Yochanan. I'm sorry, the position of Rabbi Shimon, right? Rabbi Shimon is an outlier. He's his own position. Ki kamina ali b'drabanan. So also it's very interesting. When Rabbi Yochanan gives his svara, Rabbi Yochanan says that the reason for a date in the get is to prevent the husband from protecting an adulterous wife. That was in the position of the Rabbanan, who say that a shtar mukdam, a predated shtar, is possible. I'm not espousing my idea in accordance with Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is doing his own thing, right? The fact that Rabbi Shimon says that a shtar mukdam is kosher, that's his own shita. So the Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Yochanan, Hayun diika bein Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan. So we'll say, so according to Rabbi Yochanan, now we understand the fundamental machlokes in Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan. El Reish Lakish, ma'ika bein Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan. But according to Reish Lakish, wherein lies the distinction between the views of Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan? To which the Gemara says, Peri, the Mishas Ksiva, Bachas Chasima Ikebenabas. So we're going to go through all of these cases. That's actually quite interesting. What about what's the status of Peros from between the time of the writing up until the time of the signing? Right? They'll say, listen to this. Can you imagine? Right? So they're writing the get. So we'll say, this was the same chassan who was doing deals during the chassan's tish, right? He's doing deals now during the writing of the get. So I will say, here's the shaila. What happens if he sells peros while the get is being written? Right? Can you imagine that? I will say, he's selling, fire sale, right? He's just got a couple of more minutes, right? So he's selling peros. So we'll say, watch this. According to Rabbi Shimon, such a sale would be void. Why? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, when does he lose rights of peros? From the moment that he decided to give the get. Now I will say, we don't actually know when he decided to give the get. So the earliest time that we could solidify or concretize this das is when? From the moment the get started to be written. Right? From the beginning of the writing of the get, it's clear that he's decided to get divorced. So the mais, again, Rabbi Shimon will say that from that moment, ultimately, again, he loses peros. The Rabbanan will say, no, when does he lose peros? From the time the get was at least signed / delivered. So I'll say, so an interesting nafkamina between these two opinions, ultimately, again, would be peros between the time of writing and signing. Okay, interesting. So we learn just the opposite. The itmar, me'imasai motzion leperos. So I'll say, interestingly enough, at what point in time do we take away from the husband the ability? And I will say, literally, motzion leperos means from what point in time, if the husband tried to sell the property, could the wife go and extract it from purchasers? In other words, from what point in time does husband lose rights over peros? Rabbi Yochanan Mishas Ksiva. Rabbi Yochanan says from the time of the writing of the get. Reish Lakish Mishas Nesina. Reish Lakish from the time of the giving of the get. That contradicts what we just said before. To which the Gemara says, Epoch, no problem. Just switch around the shitas. Amrli Abai Rabbi Yosef. So let's listen to this. Abai said to Rabbi Yosef, Gimel Gittin Psulin. Demnises have lad kosher. I will say there are 3 gittin which are rabbinically invalid, but if a woman marries with them, ultimately again the offspring is kosher. So I will say what that says is 3 gittin that are pasul d'Rabbanan, but if you use them and you get married with them, the children are not mamzerim, i.e., it's a bona fide divorce. Right? It's a legitimate divorce. So I will say, one second, if that's the case, mahu ilu chacham takanasan. Ultimately, I will say, if that's the case, then what good did the Chachamim do with their takana? I will say, if you're going to tell me, don't use this get, but if you used it, it's good. So what's the point of a takana like that? So you're going to say, ahanu lechatchila lo tinase. Ultimately, I will say it helps because most people would like to live within the confines of legality. So most people will avoid using such a get like this. And we'll say, what's one of the gin? Gazye lizman didei via havenehile. So I'll say, ultimately, again, what's the case? The case ultimately, again, is halach. Actually, we'll say, one of the cases is yeshalav edim ve'ein bozman. So I'll say, one of the cases of the 3 gittin is where ultimately, again, you forgot to date the get. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ideally, you should not do it. It's possible with Rabbanan. But if you did so, ultimately, again, the get still works. The Gemara says that halacha l'maisa. So if that's the case, that b'diavad it works, then what did you accomplish? To which the Gemara says, ahani v'lechatchila lo tinaseh. At least again, you've established that lechatchila a person is not going to marry such a guy. We'll say, take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi in the bottom wide lines, 4 lines in ahanu v'lechatchila lo tinaseh. Techevan dahachi hu ibay lichtov get below zman lachpos al basacho. So olim korbaperos. Both say, listen to this. What does the takana accomplish? What the takana accomplishes if you go to any reputable sofer, right, and you ask for a get, and you tell them, by the way, do me a favor, just leave off the date. Right? What is any reputable sofer going to tell you? Take a hike, right? I'm not doing that. So we'll say that's what else. So again, if you left off the date, is the get still valid? It is still valid, but lamaisa the takanas chazal ultimately helped that a sofer is not going to. We'll say one more line. Gazi lizman di dev mai. So we'll say what happens if halacha lamaisa there was a date, but halacha lamaisa the husband cut out the date. Then what's the halacha? So we'll say ultimately again amrle v'ramai lo chashinan. Ultimately, I will say for that level of Ramos, we can't be chosher. So we have to stop over here for today. Again, we're now into the fascinating sugya, ultimately, again, of Zman Begittin. More cases also, but that fundamental machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, to be, we'll ultimately see that halacha l'maisa of that in a little bit. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos. Right? So, I'm sorry again for the technical details, the technical issues earlier in the week. Great to see everyone.